Hello and welcome to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. My name is Nathalie Himmelrich. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is completely self-funded, produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. Consider making a small donation to support the podcast. Go to bit.ly/support, capital G, capital T, and podcast. I repeat, bit.ly/supportgt podcast. Thank you so much. And for more information, please visit Nathalie's website, join the podcast Instagram page, and subscribe to the newsletter to receive updates on future episodes. Welcome to a special series of podcast episodes in honor of the 10th anniversary of my first book, Grieving Parents, Surviving Loss as a Couple, published in 2014. To mark this milestone, I'm reconnecting with the same parents I initially interviewed for the book, offering a unique opportunity to revisit their stories and gain a deeper understanding of their journeys, now with the perspective of a decade's time. In recognition of October being Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Month, this series is dedicated to showcasing how grieving parents have coped with their losses and trauma over these years. These episodes aim to offer a long-term view of life after the loss of a pregnancy or an infant, providing comfort, insight and hope to those who may still be navigating their own grief. Additionally, I'm excited to offer Healing Steps, my audio course, at 25% off this month. Use the coupon code HSOCT24, I repeat HSOCT24, to access the course and begin your own journey towards healing. So welcome, Kiley. It's so nice to see you again after such a long time when we first spoke with each other. And so to give people a little bit of a background, I'm doing this interview series with grieving parents that I interviewed first time decade ago, 10 years ago, before the first book that I wrote, Grieving Parents, Surviving Loss as a Couple, came out. And one couple that I spoke to was Kiley and Hanish. So here we have today Kiley. And why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and tell us your story in regards to Norbert, for people to get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Nathalie. And it's good to see you again and connect. A little bit about me. So I live in the Los Angeles area in California. My son Norbert was stillborn 19 years ago. We just celebrated his birthday on July 12th, which it seems, it's like, that's a long time.
It is.
And at the same time, it was one of the defining moments in my life, right, where everything changed. And so, I guess just, I was newly married and we became pregnant, and it was somewhat unexpected in terms of, I didn't think for me, with my history, I would be able to get pregnant as easily as I did. And so it was like, oh, that wasn't as hard as I thought. So I became pregnant and everything seemed fine and okay. I mean, I was scared because I didn't really know what I was getting into. But, as time went on, fine pregnancy. And then I started bleeding around 35 weeks. And of course, you don't know what's happening. I didn't really realize that his movement had slowed down. And by the time I went to the doctor the next day, I thought I was going to be like delivering a baby early, because then I had started to go into labor also. And at that point, I learned that his heart had already stopped beating. I went into shock. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was going to happen. And I had a lot of, looking back, a lot of trauma around my interaction with medical providers, because no one told me, okay, this is this is what you need to do. This is what's going to happen. These are ways that you can prepare for that time in the hospital. I was in labor and they sent me home, which I just find very strange now.
Mm-hmm.
And, went back to the hospital the next day. And again, there was no guidance really from anyone. And I just know now that there's so many things you can do during that time to make memories and parent your baby, things like that. And so, I got through that. I just wanted to go home. But I did meet him and I spent an hour with him, and also like the uncertainty of what that would be like. But it's, he was my baby. He was beautiful. He just looked like he was sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
And we ended up getting an autopsy because there was something wrong. His stomach was very distended, and we're like, what went wrong? So he ended up having a liver cyst that developed late in the pregnancy. It was not there or detected in that anatomy scan around 20 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And it burst, and then that caused him to die. But it's a very random thing.
Yeah.
And then I just think that everyone I came into contact with, though, it's like no one knew what to do or say. My doctor was freaked out. The nurses really treated him, because he wasn't alive, like he wasn't precious or special to me, and that's just so wrong. But I was in shock, and I was in shock for about 6 months. Like I just couldn't function very well. And then it was like 9 years of my life where I just I ended up getting pregnant. I had a daughter about 14 months later, but again, I was suffering a lot, and I went to a lot of providers and I went to therapists, and nobody understood the nuances of this type of child death. And then I also had probably postpartum PTSD, something, but I just constant, my heart was racing. I felt like an elephant was on my chest. I didn't want to be alone with my baby. It was like, this is so hard and overwhelming. And I also recently got a late diagnosis of autism and ADHD, which helps give me a lens of why I responded the way I did. Like, I didn't cry. I just shut down because it was too much to process. And then having a new baby, there's also sensory overload, and you don't have the time alone. And you can't access any of the ways of nervous system soothing that I did before. Even though I didn't know what it was, I couldn't do it. So I had many, many years of struggle. And so now I'm just want to talk about it, because we shouldn't have to suffer in silence. And also back in 2005, the internet wasn't anything what it is now.
Absolutely.
And so there wasn't ways to find other people online, where now you can more easily do that. And then it was when Sean, he made the film Return to Zero, and he's a filmmaker, and that was his way of processing his grief. And so, he asked me, he's like, are you okay if I write this script? I feel like I really need to write this script. And I didn't think anything would ever come out of it. But then, and I said, sure, because I want to be supportive. I wasn't super involved because I think I was pregnant with my son at the time. But then once he started on Facebook, which was different than it is now, but really connecting with other parents around the world who'd been through something similar, it was like, oh my gosh, there's other people out there like us. And then hearing them talk, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, they're thinking the way that I'm thinking, or they're behaving the way that I'm behaving, and which are ways that I think are weird, but really it's not weird for those of us who've been through this experience. And so at that point, things really changed when we became connected to community.
Yeah, absolutely. I love you. I love you for saying that, because it just shows, also listening to you, I remember our conversation, and also remember that time exactly like you did, was feeling so out of the normal, the new normal, feeling so crazy, but then meeting with other people. And that's what in my case happened. I started out of a choiceless choice to write that book and then interview people. So I was talking to many people, including you and Sean, and realizing, okay, there's other people who experience what we're experiencing. And even though the losses are different, to find some common ground and to feel, yeah, okay, normal given the circumstances. And also listening to you, I realized how much has happened in the decade since we spoke. I mean, even the understanding of my personal understanding and training in trauma and early developmental trauma, and how that influences the way we, just like you were saying, ADHD and autism influences the way we hold a new trauma that appears in our life or happens to us. So I think you brought this beautiful point, that community and having other people. I mean, similarly, that's the reason of a podcast, to say, put on these shoes, listen to someone else talk about it, because you are experiencing something very normal given the circumstances that this has happened. So, I mean, for you, that lots of things happen, and this is also how we then also physically met over the Return to Zero film in Australia. So Norbert would be 19 years old today, which is amazing this time. So how do you think your grief, or how do you feel your grief over these 19 years, and more specifically also in the last decade since we spoke last, really for the book, how do you think your loss has shaped you and those around you? And secondly, how has your grief changed or developed or integrated over those years?
Yeah, the short answer is like a lot. I mean, it's changed a lot. So I think, I mean, what first comes to mind is like when I did my first few retreats with bereaved mothers, like bringing people together, like that was an idea I got in the shower. It was like a voice that I heard, like, you need to do this. And not anything I'd ever done. I had not processed my own grief to that point. Like I tried, but not enough. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to create space. Um, and the act of bringing people together and sharing helped me. Like that was probably the biggest start to my own healing journey, is by taking action.
Absolutely.
And so like, even though I was not an expert and I didn't know that much, I still felt called to do that. And I did that and learn and grow. And I learned so much from other people too. It was like the idea that we can have a relationship with our deceased babies and deceased loved ones, that's not weird, that's actually healthy. And really, I think a lot of what I do is try to bring things that are known but not well known into the light to help guide other people. It's like I'll say to myself, well, we know this. Like someone knows this. Why aren't we talking about it? Why aren't we telling other people? Why aren't we empowering parents? So I think number one, I just like highlight, it took me 9 years until I started really going on my own healing journey. So again, like people sometimes feel like I have to do something right away. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's the time will come when the time is right. And what you do in terms of taking action or honoring your child is going to be individual to you. It's not going to be like, oh, well, Nathalie's writing a book, so I need to write a book.
Exactly.
Or so-and-so's doing, hosting a memorial run, and I need to do that. It's like no, you need to do what makes sense for you, what you feel called to do, what your skills are, what do you want to change or make an impact. So I think that's important. Um, and then, so I think a lot of my own healing has come through doing. It's just, I learn, I share, and it's over the last 10, because my first retreat has been 2014. So it's been 10 years and everything has changed. You know, like I never thought I would be doing what I'm doing now, where I'm like running a nonprofit dedicated to helping parents, but also training healthcare providers, which is, I remember I had that like glimmer of a
Mm-hmm.
seed way back when, but I was so paralyzed, like I didn't know what to do. Um, and so, and I think the idea, right, is like this can break us open, but then it is an opportunity for transformation. Um, and like I can see myself now, and like I'm just so much a fuller, deeper person than I was then. Um, like I was thoughtful back then, right? But it's like when you go through these really hard things, it takes you to a different level of understanding, like the human suffering and yeah, and then the idea like you're never going to be the same as you were before, right? And so learning that and learning that like it is really like how is this part of my story? How is this building to who I am today? Um, but like everything is completely different, you know? And it also like takes time. Like I feel like grief and trauma, like I relate it a little bit to an onion. Like it's one layer at a time. Like it can't all, it's not like I'm going to go to therapy for a year and everything's going to be fine. It's not like that at all. I mean, do you find that?
No, I would say,
No?
in term, what I mean is not meaning that depends on the person. Someone, let's say what I heard when I listened to you describe, and I was looking through the trauma lens, I could see that you, from your story, the way you're telling it, the first 9 years I was basically paralyzed. It's from a nervous system point, you're in freeze, right? And from that is personal. You're home away from home, where your system, your nervous system hangs out. That is an individual thing to the person. But then, in order to come back to life, there needs to be activation. There needs to be some form of mobilization. And as you were just beautifully saying, it's not a matter of when that happens. It's a question of how, and how we can maybe support someone to come into this mobilization and then find ways to mobilize that, to integrate it. And what I see from my clients is, I mean, I am blessed, I think, with my job to support clients with that. I see clients who come to me a week after their loss. I can see clients who come to me 3 years later, or 5 or 10 or 20 years later. And I feel when they're ready to come into something else than what they have been hanging out in, hopefully something brings them to enough mobilization to reach out and go to your group, or to find something that gives them a little bit of movement into that. And when I look at those different clients that I have in my mind, I think it's amazing what happens when there is something or someone holding your hand within that, or helps you find what are the ways that you want to mobilize, that you want to, as you were saying, do something. It doesn't have to be write a book or run a charity or anything else that is big and outside. It can be something very small. Like I remember in the film Return to Zero, the father built a boat. There's different ways that grief can be mobilized to the point where I see the integration can happen. And so for me, disagreeing or agreeing with what you said, I feel that the time is not a given thing. And I like the metaphor that I often use, or is used often, is the metaphor of having a a hole in your tire on the car, and you're sitting at the side of the road, and time is not going to fix it. But what you're doing with it in the time, when you're going to call someone, or when you're going to hail another car down, or if someone stops by chance, then things start to happen. So by some kind of action, things start to happen.
Yeah.
So when you're looking at your vast experience and knowledge of groups that you run, and also with Return to Zero, the foundation, when you look at all other grieving parents, from your experience, what do you think helps them to get into this mobilization to then integrate their grief in some form?
Well, I'm not sure what gets them into mobilization. But I actively preach, and I like your language too, because I don't use the language of mobilization, but I'll say like grief, you have to be an active, and healing, an active participant in. So it's similar, it's just different language. Because if we do nothing, nothing changes. And I sat in that place for a long time. But what I see though is people coming in, like the biggest thing I see is like, they're so isolated. I'm the only one. And the power of community is so strong. Even for those of us, like, I'm not a group person. Like I don't like small talk. I don't like, all this, but especially the way that we do it, it's a very structured group. So there's not uncertainty. There's not like small talk. It's very directed. But I think people knowing they're not alone, being able to hear other people's experiences, and then also the education, like grief education piece, is empowering.
And so what you're saying is just you give them safety and structure and this is what has been lost in a trauma. There's no safety. Things happen too fast, too much, too intense for the system to be able to integrate it or to handle it. Like when I look at my clients or looking at parents, you can obviously see that even two people, if we're taking just one couple, they react to the loss of their child in very different ways. And that is because of their psychological makeup, their trauma history, their grief history, but also just who they are with it, how they relate to the loss, how they relate it to the child, what their relationship is to life and death in general. And I'm amazed at how different this can be, just even with some of the couples that I work with and that I sort of have in my memory. But what you're saying in terms of the group, the structure and the safety, that helps the nervous system to ground. Yeah. And the freeze response is a way of safety, is a way of ability to make sure that the system can deal with what's at hand. And, another metaphor that I have been using in my work with clients and my courses is the metaphor of the land after loss. And I use that in a way that I think it's important for people to come to the place where they realize they are in this land after loss and they have no choice in the matter and they can't go back. And they would have never wanted to visit that land in the first place. It wasn't on their travel agenda. But alas, they're here. And what you were saying about the loneliness that they feel, I have another picture that another grief expert gave me, it's as if all these people are floating on their individual rafts through the ocean. But there are many. It's just that we don't know and we don't see them. And when we come together on those rafts, suddenly realize, I feel alone, but I am not actually alone. I can remember even for me, from my situation, I naively thought that I'm the only person who loses one twin and has one daughter. I mean, because I wasn't in awareness of other people having the same experience, or even child loss or pregnancy loss. I wasn't in that space. And I think the two of us and many other people who do this kind of work are beneficial for people, because in our vicinity, and in everyone who's listening to this, in our vicinity, there will be someone going through that. And by us talking about it, we can make the road, pave the road for people to understand and potentially be there in different ways with those people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So one of the things we spoke about before we started recording was the saying that goes, all couples get divorced after the loss of a child. And the two of us, yes, we got divorced within the last decade. And we spoke a little bit about that. And I think it's good to give people the background, a little bit of that to understand. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And I'll share as well.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that we do hear that. And I also think that when people say that, they forget that the divorce rate is very high in general.
Exactly.
And so I think what I saw in myself, and I see in other people, is that problems that were there before the loss, they become exacerbated, and that the loss puts the extra stress and strain and pressure on. But in my case, I felt like because we'd actually been through the loss, we tried even harder to stay together, to make things work. Like, we tried for a long time, but there were things that were present before the loss that those things kind of were exacerbated. And so I don't necessarily think that, like, because of the loss, we got divorced. Like, that's not my belief. So I see in other people, right? People will also deal, like, in couples, they'll deal with the loss differently. They're grieving on different timelines in different ways. It's not aligned a lot of the time, because even though they're together, they're having to process things individually.
Mm-hmm.
So, in my case, like, I'm sure the loss didn't help anything, but I don't feel like it was like the cause of the divorce. So it's just, you get married and you're young. And you don't know enough about life and about, like, I think you don't know enough about yourself and about, like, what things are going to be an issue. You don't know these things.
Mm-hmm.
If I looked back now, yeah, but you also don't even know what's coming to you. Even outside of the loss of your child, there's other things that had happened that we couldn't have ever predicted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can full-heartedly align with what you're saying. I think to, again, add a little bit of the trauma lens to that is to understand that a couple who lose their child, it's the same kind of stressor in terms of the loss that happens at the same time. But it doesn't land on the same background, as I was saying, the backdrop of how these people have been shaped. But also that puts an extreme stress on the relationship in any case. First of all, you're pulled back into how do we deal with something so significant, so intense, and then you're still relating to each other, and life still happens. People still have to look after themselves, their family. Then more children might come into the picture, and people have to also earn their living and do their chores. So there's a lot of intensity that is captured in this couple, in the situation of a grieving parents couple. So I think that in itself, and then the nervous system, how it deals with that grief and trauma in many cases is an individual thing. And for couples to be in the same place, or where they can support one another, just one after the other, that's a reality. That is not always the case. And as you were saying, the situations that were present before the loss are exasperated. That's absolutely clear. And I think the potential that it can have is equally the, how I want to call it, like the potential for understanding yourself, of depth of life and enjoyment, as well as the intense emotions that you went through, can also be, on the other side, the potential for despair, depression, and not wanting to find a way out of that. And so there's a lot of different layers in grieving as a couple, where it wouldn't be the same if, let's say, one partner or husband-wife couple loses their job or loses their mother or their sibling. Then the one partner is less affected, less directly affected, less at the epicenter of that loss.
Yeah. Because in this case, you have two people who are hurting very badly, and they don't have the capacity to care for each other,
Exactly.
right? And so they both need to be cared for, but they need outside support to do that.
Yeah. And the idea is often in a couple that you look after me and I look after you. And then there's expectations as well. And this was the part of the book, the understanding of, why don't you grieve the way I do? And there's very little capacity for acceptance and openness to other ways to do things. Mm-hmm. Because basically you are at rock bottom and you have a limited amount of resilience and energy left for acceptance and gratitude and all of the emotions or states that we can normally have.
And I think I just want to go back to one thing you said that just I knew, but it really, like, I had an understanding when you're talking about it, is that trauma doesn't land the same for each person. And so recognizing that each person has had however old they are, their lifetime up until that point of who they are, what trauma they've been through in the past, what their loss history has been in the past, things like that. And so this is placed upon that, and that is it reactivating something, right? That whether it's been processed or not, like, we just, like, each person is so individual. And I think sometimes, I know Betsy, who's in charge of our community support groups, like, you know, for her, it's like it has awakened this whole past trauma, like awareness for her of her childhood. And so what is it bringing up for all of us in that, you know, maybe we don't have a traumatic childhood, but maybe we do. And what has happened? So that's just really kind of deeper understanding for me when you said that.
Thank you. So if you were to look back, if you're finding a place to round this all up, what would you want other people who listen to this, maybe there's grieving parents, or maybe there's supporters of grieving parents, or maybe just other people who've experienced the loss or trauma, given your journey since you had Norbert and had to say goodbye to Norbert, with everything that has happened, what would you want others to know that would be beneficial to them?
I think the biggest thing is finding community of other people who've been through something similar. Like, that's probably the biggest thing. And then if you're a supporter of a bereaved parent, to not be afraid to talk about what has happened, to use the baby's name, you know, because I think people are scared to do that because they think, oh, I'm going to upset that person. I'm going to remind them. But we're already upset or reminded. We're thinking about it, and we don't want to forget it, you know? And like, how do we keep the memory of our baby alive? Because they are, I mean, we like, you and I and other people, like, we celebrate our babies' birthdays. We they have changed our lives. And so we want other people, we don't want them to just continue to live their life. We want them to remember with us. It makes us feel good.
Yeah, that's beautiful that you say that. And I smiled because for us it is so normal. We work with parents and teach them how to parent a child after they're not physically here with you. And one of the things that I say, and I think I can't say it enough, we don't have enough role models. Like, we have a lot of role models of other parents, and we see what they're doing that we think is good and what we think is not so good. But we don't have a lot of role models or open role models as to how do you parent or how do you stay in relationship with someone that you've lost. And that is, for us, very common language. But for those who are experiencing that and who need support, it is not something that they know, as well as those who support them. And I smiled also when you said, say their name. And I just remembered a couple of days ago, I had a conversation with my daughter, because in my office on the wall are pictures of another friend that you probably know as well from the community, Ginny. She sent me these letters to spell out the name of Maya. And so another May, my daughter asked me, so why is it spelled like that? And so we had a whole conversation about the spelling. And I said, when we chose her name, we knew that no one's ever going to be bothered about the spelling, and she wouldn't have to spell her name. I wouldn't have to say to people, this is how I'm spelling it, this is how I'm pronouncing it. And I could just choose a name. And I chose the name not because of that, and so we had this whole conversation, and I loved it. Because I said, no one's saying her name besides us. And it is these precious moments that we want to invite those around us also to dare and speak, as you were saying, speak about them. And some people have memories with their children, and to speak about them, because as you were just saying, we haven't forgotten. We'd love to remember. The same way as my mother, who's not here, I still remember her. Yes, I have more history with her than with my child, who was only with me in my case, and in your case in my belly, but I still want to remember her. That time is not reflective of the impact that someone has made in our lives. As we can see, both of us are dedicating our lives in support of others who have experienced similar losses as we have. So all the links to what Kiley is doing with Return to Zero will be in the show notes. But just tell us a little bit about Return to Zero so that people understand what this foundation is for. I mean, you mentioned a little bit, but let's give it a good summary.
So Return to Zero Hope is a nonprofit organization. We're officially 5 years old this year, and we have lots of resource education and support for grieving parents through virtual support groups, retreats, free webinars, information on the website. There's lots of stuff. We have a directory of providers and support groups and organizations for people, like by locations, if they're trying to find something where they live. We have a section for family and friends on the website. So again, education just to help them understand what's going on and understand their own grief and how they can support the grieving parents. And then healthcare providers is another passion of mine. So helping to train healthcare providers who will come in contact with these parents, whether it's during the loss, after the loss, because they don't get any formal training either. And so giving them materials, trainings, information, resources to help them be more confident when working with these families, because that can make a huge difference.
Absolutely.
The care that people receive. So.
Absolutely. I can wholeheartedly agree again, because the care that I had when we lost our daughter, I'm so blessed to say my experience of loss was so supported and held. And that's the key, that trauma isn't overwhelming. It's by the support, the people that are there for you. That's what is actually the counter effect. in trauma. That's what we know. If you're not alone, because trauma definition is you've experienced something alone that has been overwhelming, too much, too fast to deal with. So if you have people there, obviously it depends on when it happened and how it happens. We knew that, no, we didn't know, but in terms of the support, it was just there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Kiley, for the time and for the conversation today again. And thank you so much for all that you do for the community.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. It was good to connect and just good to take some time to reflect, see like what has changed and how. It is truly unbelievable when you stop and reflect. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me on as a guest and for the work you're doing and just also having these interviews 10 years later. So it's important.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to How to Deal with Grief and Trauma. If you'd like to be updated on future episodes, please subscribe to my newsletter on NathalieHimmelrich.com. If you need grief support, please contact me for a 30 minutes free discovery session. How to Deal with Grief and Trauma is produced and edited by me, Nathalie Himmelrich. To support this podcast, please rate, review, and subscribe to or follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you. And remember to keep breathing. I promise it will get easier.